This is Grandmaster Daniel Naroditsky. We are watching Hikaru Nakamura taking on Vladislav Artemiev at the 2022 FIDE World Blitz. Artemiev is one of the strongest Grandmasters in Russia, an incredibly strong Blitz player. This is not going to be an easy matter for Nakamura, and we have a bishop's opening. Hikaru brings the bishop out to c4, and that is the first minor piece that he develops in this opening. It has been pretty popular in the last couple of years. It's a popular Blitz weapon, and Artemiev uses the c6 square, not for his knight, as is more customary, but instead for his pawn, as he tries to get control of the center with d7, d5. That is an idea that we see often from the white side in these Italian positions, but before playing d5, he decides to castle kingside, and let's see where Hikaru puts his own knight on g1. Knight to f3 is the conventional developing move, but instead he plays queen f3. What an interesting choice by Nakamura. He says, if you're not going to play d5 on the previous move, then you're not going to play d5 at all, and indeed, Artemiev choosing a more modest way of pushing his pawn out to d6 and opens up his bishop on c8. And that queen on f3, you could argue that it's misplaced. It could be vulnerable to an attack by black's light-squared bishop from g4. But Hikaru, he could slide that queen over to g3, and one could even argue that the queen belongs on g3. It will be x-raying the pawn on g7 and setting up various threats against black's king. Some tough problems here to solve for Vladislav Artemiev, and he takes a bit of a think. Hikaru seems relaxed there as he's chewing on something, leaning back in his chair. He's got a 20-second time advantage. Now it's up to 25. And I think what Artemiev is deciding is where he wants to develop his light-squared bishop. Bishop e6 is one possibility. Of course, he can play bishop g4 and then perhaps follow up with d5. And indeed, he settles for the more conventional choice, bishop c8 out to e6. And I don't think Hikaru is going to trade bishops on e6 because that will open up the f-file. And with white's queen sitting on the f-file, that opens up some nasty possibilities of a discovered attack. And indeed, the tension is being kept now by both players. Hikaru finally pushes the h-pawn up to h3, covering the g4 square. Now the queen on f3 is perfectly safe. A very interesting method of development chosen by Nakamura, and he drives the knight over to g3. He's starting to assemble some of his pieces quite menacingly on the king side. That knight from g3 can jump out to f5, putting pressure not only on g7, but also on the d6 pawn, which has been weakened by Artemiev's early c6 moves. So Vladislav with some problems to solve here, and he tries to solve them first by playing h6 and covering the g5 square, preventing the most active development of white's dark-squared bishop. But Hikaru says, I don't need my dark-squared bishop, I need my knight. That knight is now sitting pretty on f5, biting into the d6 pawn. Of course, Artemiev could take it with his bishop, but that would concede the bishop here and give white uncontested control over the light squares. Maybe he can take on f5 and follow up with knight c5 and try to root out white's light-squared bishop. That might be a concrete way to play, and indeed, the Russian Grandmaster does exactly that. He moves his knight up to c5, he hits the bishop on b3, and if Hikaru slides his bishop up to c4, then Artemiev could follow up finally by playing d5, and the bishop is essentially out of squares. Hikaru might have to part ways with that bishop. Maybe king to h1 and f4 is an interesting idea, trying to reopen the king side, but now it's Hikaru Nakamura's turn to take a slightly longer think, and king h1 is on the board. He does have to watch out because the move f4 would run into g6. The queen on f5 would actually be trapped, so f4 is not yet a threat, and Artemiev, he doesn't want to play with fire. He plays queen to d7, driving the queen out of f5. Obviously, a queen trade is squarely in black's favor. Black is the side that is down space. Now, bishop takes h6 is a huge threat here. The pawn on g7 is overloaded. Artemiev might want to buttress that knight on f6 by playing queen to e6. He might want to move the knight out of f6 entirely and push his own f-pawn up to f5, and a little hesitation there. He almost missed bishop takes h6. I thought he had his hand on the d6 pawn. Now cooler heads prevail, and he pushes his queen up to e6, much to the chagrin of Hikaru Nakamura, who brings his other knight back to e2. That first knight, it had a turn on f5. Now it's time for the other knight to occupy the space left vacant by its brother. Knight to g3 is on the board. I still like Hikaru's position. He's got over a minute up on the clock. And a little hesitation there. Not sure what move he was about to play, but he's going to have to move that same piece. Plenty of time to think for Nakamura to find ways to tighten the screws on the king side, and bishop to d2 is on the board, completing his minor piece development and connecting his rooks. Artemiev brings his own rook out to d8, and Hikaru does much the same, rook a to e1. Now, in the event of a trade on e4, Hikaru would not recapture with the pawn because the bishop on d2 would be hanging. Instead, he would take back with the knight, and the pressure on the e5 pawn would grow potentially unbearable. The tension once again being kept by both players. Now, knight f5 is unfortunately not possible for Hikaru because then Artemiev would take on e4 and white wouldn't have the option of recapturing with the pawns. That bishop on d2 in a certain sense is actually misplaced. It's under that x-ray of the rook on d8. Maybe that bishop is worth putting on c3 and eliminating that headache. And Hikaru does eliminate the headache, but he does it in a different way. He plays rook to e2 and on demand taking on e4. Now the bishop on d2 is nicely protected by his rook. The center is open, the position becoming more and more complex and tense, but Artemiev is such a good player in acute time pressure. I don't think he's too worried here. His position remains very solid, and Nishikori coming closer there to take a look. Rook to d7 by Vladislav, preparing to double his rooks on the d file and potentially infiltrate to d1. Every piece trade greatly relieves the burden for black on the king side. It makes white's attack less and less impressive. Hikaru moves his bishop up to c3, and now he is pressuring the e5 pawn. Artemiev responds not by completing the doubling of his rooks. He's really in no hurry to do that. Instead, he first plays g6 to restrict the mobility of the g3 knight, a very powerful positional move, and now he doubles rooks on the d-file. And bishop to d4 is on the board, essentially forcing the trade of the bishops. And with minor pieces dwindling, Hikaru's once impressive kingside attack really has been rendered utterly harmless, but he's trying to reignite the flame there by playing f4, a move definitely chosen partly because of Artemiev's time pressure. Vladislav is down to 20 seconds, and now he's got to figure out a way to try to keep the f file closed. I don't think he can keep it closed, but he can try to counterattack on the d file. We have a trade on f4, and Hikaru now threatening to double his own rooks on f1 and chase that knight out of f6, and behind that knight sits a very weak f7 pawn. That pawn is currently defended, though, by the rook on d7 with 4 seconds on the clock. Artemiev preemptively moves his knight out of g8, and now he further supports the f7 pawn by moving his king to g7. Hikaru with the Alekhine's gun on the f-file. He was actually attacking the pawn on a7, a hidden threat posed by Hikaru's last move, but Artemiev stays on top. He is not panicking with 5 seconds on the clock. Knight to e2. Hikaru continuing to create threat after threat, and he maneuvers his knight up to d4, chiseling his way into black's position. Artemiev still holding, though, with queen to d6, and he could try to follow up by playing c5 and chasing that knight out of d4. Hikaru's got to find a way to keep his foot on the gas pedal. Artemiev is not going to beat himself here. Rook to g4 comes to mind in order to threaten knight f5 check, but in that case, Artemiev could simply slide his king from g7 to h7 or perhaps to h8. And Hikaru, he plays queen to e3, choosing a slightly slower approach. But Artemiev immediately moves his rook up to e7. He is not allowing Hikaru the possibility of pushing his e-pawn forward. There we see it, queen g3, king h8. Artemiev doesn't miss the fork, and Hikaru goes back to f2. Obviously, black is fine with the repetition of moves here, but with 6 seconds on black's clock, I don't think Hikaru is going for the repetition. No, he's not. He's moving his queen up to g4, but now Artemiev chases the knight out of d4, and the knight moves back to f3. 2 seconds there as Artemiev offers a trade of queens. Hikaru declines it, and there Artemiev brought his king back to g7. He was threatening to fork white's queen and rook with g5. Now he's threatening another fork. Oh, Hikaru might be losing the grip here. Knight to g5, a knight sacrifice. Well, it's not really a sacrifice. He takes on f6, and Artemiev with queen to e5, another queen trade offer. Still seems like everything is stable here for black. Notice that black could not have taken that rook on f6, because at the end of the line, queen d6 check would have picked up another rook, and Hikaru suddenly in acute time pressure. As he plays queen f2, he's given up a pawn. A very ambitious choice by Hikaru, still trying to play against black's time pressure. Oh, g4. G4 is a very powerful move, and Magnus Carlsen runs over to take a look, and Hikaru, he takes on g4, but he allows an attack down the h-file, and there's a check on h2, and suddenly Artemiev is on the offensive. Can he finish it off? There goes his other rook. Where is he going to put it? He puts it on e4, he attacks g4, and he takes that pawn, and he threatens g2, and Hikaru is now completely lost. But can he swindle Artemiev in time pressure? I don't think so. Another check on e8, and things are moving fast. Queen to g3 check. That queen is untouchable. Another beautiful tactical move, and Artemiev takes the pawn on g2. He is now 2 pawns up, and if he wants, he can simply trade queens here and win that resulting endgame. What incredible technique in time pressure by Artemiev. An amazing game as he defeats Hikaru Nakamura despite the acute time pressure. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to click the link in the playlist for more of these Blitz videos.